GG asterisk asterisk asterisk. The hall was full of golden light, chandeliers glittering above the heads of Hollywood's most famous stars. Everyone was smiling, raising glasses, and exchanging warm greetings. The event was supposed to be a night of charity, a night where actors, directors, and producers gathered not for business, but for helping children's hospitals and schools. The red carpet was rolled out, cameras flashed, and the entire world seemed to be watching through the eyes of the reporters standing outside. In the middle of this glamorous evening walked Keanu Reeves, tall and calm, dressed in a simple black suit. Unlike many of the other stars who came with loud entourages and flashing jewelry, Keanu was quiet, polite, almost humble. He shook hands, smiled softly, and moved through the crowd with the grace of a man who did not need attention to be noticed. People whispered about him as he passed. "That's Keanu. He's the kindest man in Hollywood." One guest whispered. Another said, "He doesn't even have security with him. He's just normal." For years, Keanu had built a reputation that was unlike any other actor. He was not only famous for his roles in action films and thrillers, but also for being a man who treated waiters, cleaners, and fans with the same respect he gave to other actors. Stories of his kindness spread far and wide. He once gave up his subway seat to a tired woman. Another time he bought food for a homeless man and sat with him on the street. People admired him because he was different in a city known for arrogance and ego. But that night, something happened that nobody could have expected. While Keanu stood near a table speaking politely to a group of young filmmakers, another man entered the room. His name was well known, a powerful Hollywood producer who had made blockbuster movies that earned hundreds of millions at the box office. He walked with the confidence of a king, his voice loud, his presence heavy. People stepped aside as he passed. He had money, he had power. But what he didn't have was the respect that Keanu carried so easily for years. This producer had secretly envied Keanu. He couldn't understand why audiences loved him so much. He couldn't understand why critics praised not only his work but his character. The producer was used to controlling actors, shaping their careers, making or breaking them. But Keanu had always remained outside of that control. He lived life on his own terms, never bowing to Hollywood politics. That independence made the producer furious. As the night went on, drinks were poured, laughter filled the air, and people clapped as donations were announced. But in the corner of the hall, a small argument began. The producer and Keanu exchanged words. At first it was quiet, but soon the producer's voice grew louder. Guests nearby turned their heads, confused and curious. What could anyone possibly argue about with Keanu Reeves, the man known for patience and calm? The producer accused him of being fake, of pretending to be humble just to win fans. His words were sharp, bitter, soaked with jealousy. Keanu didn't answer back harshly. He simply shook his head, his calm smile never fading. He tried to step away, not wanting to create a scene, but the producer, carried away by anger and pride, followed him, and then, in a moment that froze the room, the man raised his hand and struck Keanu across the face. The sound of the slap echoed louder than the music, louder than the clinking glasses. It was as if the entire hall had fallen silent at once. Guests gasped, some screamed, others dropped their drinks. A famous actress covered her mouth in shock. Cameras that had been filming the event for charity turned instantly toward the chaos. Keanu did not fight back. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood still, his expression calm. He touched his cheek lightly, his eyes steady. His silence was louder than any words. Around him, people waited for him to explode, to push back, to do something dramatic, but instead, he simply turned and began to walk away. His slow steps across the shining floor made the producer look smaller with each second. In that moment, the world saw something unforgettable. The producer, red-faced and trembling with anger, had wanted to humiliate Keanu. Instead, he humiliated himself. The guests stared at him not with fear, not with respect, but with disgust. Cameras captured everything, and in a matter of minutes, the story was already spreading outside the walls of the hall. What began as a night of glitter and charity had turned into a scandal. A single slap had shaken Hollywood. A single act of anger had turned the spotlight away from the stars and onto a man who had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But no one in that room knew yet just how expensive that slap would be. No one knew that it would not only stain the producer's reputation but destroy his empire. That moment was the beginning of the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable, and the rise of Keanu's legend as more than just an actor, but as a symbol of grace under fire. And as Keanu quietly left the hall that night, not a single person doubted whose side history would take. His silence had already spoken, louder than any words, louder than any fight, louder than the slap itself. It was a silence the whole world would soon hear. The man who had slapped Keanu Reeves was not just anyone. He was a Hollywood giant, a producer whose name had been attached to blockbuster after blockbuster. For years he had lived in the spotlight, not as an actor, but as the man behind the curtain. He controlled casting, approved scripts, and often decided who would rise and who would fall in the film industry. When his name appeared on a movie poster, investors lined up, stars begged to work with him, and audiences rushed to theaters. He was powerful, wealthy, and feared. But power has a way of feeding pride, and pride has a way of turning into arrogance. The producer had started his career with big dreams, and for a while, he was known as hardworking and ambitious. He had come from nothing, and people admired him for climbing so high in an industry that crushed most people. Yet as the millions poured in, something inside him changed. He began to see himself not as a man but as a king, someone who could not be questioned, someone who believed every actor owed him loyalty. In private, stories about his temper circulated for years. Assistants whispered about shouting fits behind closed doors. Writers complained that he destroyed scripts with his ego. Crew members talked about how he treated them as tools rather than people, but because his movies made money, no one dared to challenge him. Hollywood forgives many sins if profits keep flowing. Still, there was always one name he could not control: Keanu Reeves. For years he tried. He offered him roles, demanded changes, even hinted that Keanu should play by his rules like other actors did. But Keanu always refused politely. He was never rude, never angry. But he made his boundaries clear. He chose roles carefully. He turned down millions if it didn't feel right. And he refused to let any producer dictate his life. This infuriated the producer. To him, actors were pawns, pieces on his chessboard to be moved at his command. But Keanu was different. He was not greedy. He was not desperate. And he was not afraid of losing a role. In fact, he once gave away part of his own salary so that the stunt team and special effects crew could be paid better. Stories like that spread quickly, and the more the world loved Keanu, the more the producer's jealousy burned. So when the night of the charity gala came, the producer was already carrying years of silent resentment. He arrived in a tailored suit, his expensive watch glittering, his smile wide for the cameras. He shook hands with actors, made promises to investors, and gave a speech about generosity and art. On the surface, he looked like the perfect Hollywood success story. But underneath, he was boiling with envy. The sight of Keanu standing calmly among fans and filmmakers only fueled that envy. Here was a man who didn't chase money, yet had respect. Here was a man who didn't shout, yet had authority. Here was a man who never demanded attention, yet all eyes naturally turned to him. The producer hated it. He hated that Keanu's power came not from money, but from character. And then came the breaking point. A few casual words, a simple conversation, turned into an argument. At first, it was almost laughable. Guests thought it would end quickly, but the producer's voice grew louder. His hands shook with rage, and years of jealousy spilled out of his mouth. He accused Keanu of being fake, of pretending to be kind for cameras. He accused him of manipulating the public with his silence. The words were ugly, bitter, and shocking, especially because everyone knew Keanu's kindness was real. Keanu.com, as ever, did not fire back. He didn't insult him. He didn't fight for the crowd's approval. He simply said, "I don't think this is the time or the place," and tried to move away. But that calmness made the producer even angrier. To him, walking away was humiliation. It was as if Keanu was silently saying, "You're not worth my time." That wounded his pride more than any insult could. And so, in front of hundreds of witnesses, the producer snapped. His hand struck Keanu's face. It was fast, it was loud, and it was final. In that instant, all the masks fell. No amount of money, no expensive suit, no speech about generosity could cover what the world had just seen. The man behind the slap was not powerful anymore. He was not respected. He was not feared. He was just a bitter man who had let his jealousy control him. The silence in the room after the slap was more powerful than applause. Everyone looked at him not as a king but as a fool, and in his heart, though he didn't admit it, he knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. From that moment forward, his story would no longer be about the movies he produced or the millions he earned. It would be about the night he let envy destroy everything he had built. He thought he was striking down a rival, but in truth he had just struck himself. And while Keanu quietly left the hall, carrying no anger on his face, the producer stood frozen, his hands still trembling, his empire beginning to crack. He didn't know it yet, but the cost of that slap would soon be measured not in shame alone, but in millions, 200 million to be exact. The sound of the slap still hung in the air. But what came next shocked people even more. Everyone expected Keanu to react, to raise his voice, to push the man back. It was natural. After all, he had been humiliated in front of hundreds of people, live cameras, and the biggest stars in Hollywood. Yet, Keanu did something nobody predicted. He stood completely still, his face calm, his hands steady. His eyes met the producer's with quiet strength, and then he simply lowered his gaze, as if refusing to give the man even the satisfaction of a response. That silence spread across the hall like a wave. People whispered, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to fight. Some guests even stepped closer, afraid a physical fight was about to begin. But Keanu did not move. He did not shout. He did not hit back. Instead, he touched his cheek lightly, blinked once, and then took a slow breath. His entire body language said more than words ever could. In Hollywood, where egos often clash like storms, this was something extraordinary. The normal reaction would have been anger, revenge, or a dramatic scene. But Keanu had always been different, and now, in front of flashing cameras, he proved it again. By not reacting, he took away the producer's power. The man wanted chaos. He wanted Keanu to fight. He wanted to turn the event into a battlefield. But Keanu gave him nothing, only calmness. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some clapped quietly. Others whispered to each other. One young actor said under his breath, "That's strength, right there." A famous actress, with tears in her eyes, said, "Only Keanu could do this." The producer, however, was trembling with rage. He had wanted to see Keanu angry. He had wanted to see him lose control. Instead, it was his own face that looked red, his own hands that shook. Keanu then did something unforgettable. He turned his back, not in weakness, but in silent rejection. Each step he took toward the exit seemed to echo louder than the slap itself. His shoes clicked against the floor as the cameras followed. The whole room watched him go, their respect growing with every step, by walking away. Keanu was saying something clear: violence and arrogance were not worth his time. He would not lower himself to the producer's level. People often say silence is powerful, but that night the world truly understood it. The producer had tried to break Keanu's image, but instead, Keanu's silence made him appear even stronger. In that silence, he showed patience, dignity, and control. And everyone in the hall felt it deeply. Behind him, the producer shouted something, his words desperate and bitter, but no one listened anymore. The moment Keanu walked away, the balance shifted. The producer was no longer the man in control. He was the man who lost control. The spotlight was no longer on him as a leader of Hollywood, but on him as the man who struck in anger and gained nothing. Outside the hall, reporters swarmed, flashing cameras at Keanu, asking him to comment. He simply smiled politely and said, "It was a good night for charity. Nothing more, nothing less." His refusal to even acknowledge the slap frustrated the reporters but amazed the public. He was not feeding the scandal. He was refusing to let it live. Inside the hall, the mood had changed. The producer stood alone, his reputation already cracking. People moved away from him, not wanting to be caught in the storm. Some of his closest allies whispered to each other that this would not end well. They knew Hollywood was a place of image, and one public mistake could cost millions. The producer had not only made a mistake, he had made it against the one actor everyone respected. Later that night, clips of the slap and Keanu's silent walk away flooded the internet. Millions of views poured in within hours. Fans praised him, calling him the definition of grace. Hashtags trended worldwide. #respect. Keanu became the symbol of the night. People admired him not just as an actor but as a human being. Someone wrote, "The loudest answer is silence." Another said, "This is why we love him." Meanwhile, the producer became the target of anger. His name was dragged through headlines. Not for his success but for his violence. Memes mocked him, fans attacked him, and even fellow actors condemned him. His empire had cracks now, and those cracks were growing larger with every passing hour. But in that moment, when Keanu touched his cheek, took a breath, and walked away, no one could have predicted just how far the consequences would spread. What looked like silence was, in fact, the strongest statement he had ever made. And what looked like power in the producer's hand was actually the beginning of his downfall. Keanu had always lived by a philosophy. He believed in kindness, respect, and patience. He believed that you didn't need to fight every battle. Some fights were won simply by refusing to play. That night, he proved his belief to the whole world. His reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction, became the turning point of the entire story. The slap was loud, but the silence was louder. The slap was quick, but the silence lasted forever. And as Keanu disappeared into the night, leaving behind the glitter of Hollywood and the shame of the producer, everyone realized that history would not remember the strike. It would remember the man who chose not to strike back. By the next morning, the entire world was talking about the slap. What had begun as a glittering charity event had turned into the biggest scandal Hollywood had seen in years. News outlets replayed the clip again and again. The moment of the producer's hand striking Keanu's face, followed by Keanu's calm silence, and his walk toward the exit, was everywhere. On television, on phones, on laptops. Social media caught fire. Millions of people commented. Fans from every corner of the world rushed to defend Keanu. They called him a symbol of dignity, a man of peace, and a hero who refused to sink to the level of violence. The hashtag with his name trended globally. Memes filled the internet. Some showed the producer red with anger, while others praised Keanu's calm expression as the true face of strength. The public's reaction was not only emotional but also furious. People demanded action. They wanted consequences for the producer. They said Hollywood could not stay silent when such a thing happened to one of its most respected stars. Many fans wrote messages like, "If they forgive him, we won't forgive Hollywood. And this man doesn't deserve to make another movie." Celebrities, too, began to speak out. Famous actors and actresses took to interviews and online platforms to share their thoughts. One award-winning actress said, "Keanu's silence was more powerful than any punch. He showed us what real strength is." Another actor wrote, "There's no excuse for what happened. We can't tolerate violence in our industry, especially against someone who has given us nothing but kindness. Directors and producers who once worked with the man started to distance themselves. Each statement added more pressure. Each voice made the scandal heavier. Inside the Hollywood community, the producer's allies began to feel the heat. For years they had stood by him because of his money and power, but now they were worried. Association with him meant trouble. Investors didn't want to risk being linked to his name, and actors didn't want to ruin their reputations by being seen with him. The man who had once controlled careers was now toxic. At the same time, Keanu's image shone brighter than ever before. Reporters camped outside his home, hoping for a dramatic statement. But Keanu refused to fuel the fire. He answered calmly when asked, "I hope we can move on. It was a charity night, and the children are what mattered most." His refusal to attack or insult the producer made people love him even more. To fans, it was proof that his kindness was not fake. It was real. It was who he was. The contrast between the two men could not have been clearer. On one side stood the producer, angry, jealous, desperate. On the other side stood Keanu.com, humble, respected. The world didn't hesitate to choose which man they would stand behind. Soon, late-night talk shows turned the incident into their main topic. Comedians joked about the $200 million slap, but behind the laughter, the truth was obvious. The producer's career was collapsing, and Keanu's decision to stay silent was being taught as a lesson in self-control. In other countries, the story was just as big. Newspapers in Europe, Asia, and South America printed the headline with shock. People who barely knew Hollywood stars suddenly knew Keanu's name, not just as an actor, but as a man who handled violence with grace. Even people who had never watched his movies admired him. They said, "If this is who he is in real life, then we respect him more than any character he ever played." The producer, meanwhile, tried to explain himself. He released a short statement, saying he had been under stress, that he had been drinking, that the moment was a mistake. But the apology sounded hollow. The public did not forgive so easily. They said it was not about stress or alcohol, it was about arrogance and envy, and those were things no excuse could hide. As days passed, the video views climbed into the hundreds of millions. It became one of the most replayed clips in Hollywood history. Every replay was another reminder of Keanu's dignity and the producer's downfall. Every share spread the story further. Behind closed doors, big studios were holding meetings. Lawyers were asking questions. Contracts with the producer were being reviewed. Money was on the line. The scandal was too big to ignore. Too many people were demanding consequences. Hollywood had always been a place of power games. But now the power was not in the hands of producers, it was in the hands of the people. The audience had spoken. They stood with Keanu. For Keanu, life returned to normal as best it could. He went back to his quiet routines, riding the subway, speaking gently to fans, helping strangers without cameras. But for the producer, the nightmare was only just beginning. His phone stopped ringing, meetings were canceled, and his once loyal partners began to disappear, one by one. The world had decided. The slap might have lasted a second, but its echo shook Hollywood to its core. The reaction was not just against one man's violence, but against everything he represented: ego, arrogance, and disrespect. And as the dust settled, one truth became clear to everyone. In the battle of pride versus dignity, dignity had won. The fallout began faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the video spreading, investors who had poured money into the producer's upcoming film started making phone calls. They were nervous. Their money was tied to his name, and now his name was poison. No one wanted to see their project collapse under public anger. The first investor pulled out quietly, hoping nobody would notice. Then another followed. By the end of the week, half the film's budget had disappeared. This was not a small project. It was supposed to be a blockbuster worth $200 million. Stars had been signed, sets had been prepared, contracts had been drawn, but suddenly the machine stopped working. The studio, worried about its image, began to distance itself. From the producer, they released a short statement saying they were reviewing the situation. Everyone in Hollywood knew what that meant. It meant the producer was being cut loose. Actors who had once fought to be in his movies started refusing. Some called their agents and said, "Get me out of this contract. I don't want my face tied to his name." Others went silent, but behind closed doors, they were terrified. Being seen with him could ruin their careers. In Hollywood, reputation is everything, and his was crumbling faster than anyone thought possible. Meanwhile, Keanu was busier than ever. Ironically, the slap that was meant to humiliate him only made him shine brighter. Studios called him, directors wanted him, investors said, "If Keanu is in, we are in too." It was almost poetic. One man lost everything with one slap, and the other gained even more respect by saying nothing. The producer tried to hold on. He scheduled meetings with the studio. He promised he could repair the damage. He said the audience would forget in a few weeks. But the numbers told a different story. Marketing polls showed the public hated him. His approval ratings had fallen to the bottom. If his name was attached to a movie, people promised they wouldn't buy tickets. For the studio, it was simple. Math keeping him meant losing money. Behind the scenes, lawyers began circling. Investors wanted their money back. Actors threatened lawsuits to escape contracts. Business partners who had been loyal for years started cutting ties. The empire he had built was collapsing like a sandcastle against the tide, all because of one night, one moment, one slap. It was not just money he lost, but power. For decades, people had feared him. They whispered his name with caution. They said he could destroy a career with a single phone call. But now, when he called, nobody answered. When he demanded, nobody obeyed. The man who thought he controlled Hollywood was suddenly powerless. At the same time, journalists dug deeper into his past. Old stories resurfaced. Assistants who had once stayed silent spoke up. Former partners admitted he had been difficult, arrogant, disrespectful. They said they were not surprised by the slap. They said it was the mask finally slipping. These stories fueled the fire, making the public even more angry. The image of a powerful man was now replaced with that of a bully exposed. The charity gala, meant to be remembered for raising millions for children, was now remembered only for the slap. The producer's name was tied to shame, Keanu's name, tied to grace. The financial loss grew bigger by the day. Advertisers backed out. Sponsors removed his name from posters. Streaming platforms reconsidered deals. It was like watching dominoes fall, one after the other. Nobody wanted to be the last one standing beside him. $200 million, that was the number everyone repeated. That was the cost of his pride, the cost of one slap. Keanu, on the other hand, never gloated. He never smiled at the man's downfall. When asked by reporters about the producer's troubles, he simply said, "I wish him peace. I hope he finds a better path." That kind of compassion made people admire him even more. It showed that Keanu was not just a good actor, but a good human. The more he spoke with kindness, the more the producer's cruelty looked ugly. Hollywood is a place where images are built carefully, but in this case, the producer destroyed his own image with a single hand. He thought a slap would show power. Instead, it showed weakness. He thought Keanu would be embarrassed. Instead, Keanu became an icon. The studios officially announced the movie was canceled. The $200 million already invested were gone. Investors called it the most expensive mistake in Hollywood history. People joked bitterly that it was the slap heard around the world. But nobody was laughing at the financial disaster. For the producer, it was the end of his golden throne. He had spent decades climbing, building, controlling, but in less than a week, everything had been ripped away. He became a warning, a symbol of how arrogance could destroy even the most powerful. And for Keanu, it was proof that dignity always wins. He didn't need to lift a finger. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need revenge. The world had seen the truth that respect, once lost, cannot be bought back with all the money in the world. The business fallout was complete. A $200 million empire had turned to dust, and all because one man could not control his pride. While the producer's empire fell apart, Keanu continued his life with the same quiet grace. Reporters followed him, desperate for a dramatic comment. They wanted anger. They wanted him to insult the man who had slapped him. They wanted him to seek revenge. But Keanu gave them nothing like that. Instead, he spoke softly and simply. His words carried the same calm energy as his actions on that night. When asked about the slap, Keanu would only smile faintly and say, "Sometimes the best response is no response." Those words spread quickly. Fans shared them, news anchors repeated them, and people began to realize that his silence was not weakness, it was strength. It was philosophy. It was the way he chose to live his life. This was not new for Keanu. For years, people had admired him for the way he treated others. He was not just an actor. He was a man who believed in kindness. He gave up his seat on subways. He spoke to fans as equals. He treated crew members with respect. He never acted like a man above others. He believed everyone deserved dignity. That was his way. Now the world saw his philosophy tested in the harshest way. He had been publicly humiliated, and yet he stayed. Instead of hate, he showed patience. Instead of revenge, he chose forgiveness. When a journalist pressed him with the question, "Do you want the producer punished?" Keanu shook his head and said, "What happened is already done. I can only control what I do next." That one sentence captured hearts everywhere. Even psychologists began to analyze his reaction. Articles appeared online explaining how silence could turn humiliation into victory. People used Keanu's silence as an example in schools and workplaces. Motivational speakers quoted him. Spiritual leaders admired him. A simple act of walking away had become a global lesson in strength. Keanu himself didn't act like a man giving lessons. He simply lived as he always had. For him, it wasn't about teaching others. It was about staying true to his beliefs. He believed that violence only creates more violence. He believed that pride destroys people. He believed that the only thing that truly matters is how you treat others. The contrast between him and the producer grew sharper. The producer tried to rebuild his image by releasing apologies, long statements full of excuses. He said he was under stress. He said it was the alcohol. He said it was a mistake. But the more he spoke, the worse it sounded. His words were empty. They felt forced. Meanwhile, Keanu's few simple sentences felt powerful because they came from the heart. On social media, people began writing messages like, "Be like Keanu," and "Silence is strength." Memes showed him as a peaceful warrior. Untouched by hate, his calm face became a symbol of dignity. Children wrote essays about him. Teachers used his story to explain how anger can ruin lives. Fans said, "This is why he will always be our hero." One interview stood out. When asked how he managed to stay calm, Keanu answered, "Life is too short to waste on anger. I'd rather spend it helping someone who needs it." Those words touched millions. People repeated them as if they were poetry. They were simple but carried wisdom. This philosophy also began to change how Hollywood saw him. To many, he was no longer just an actor, he was a role model. Directors admired him not only for his talent but for his character. Producers wanted to work with him not only for his box office draw but for the respect he brought to any project. Keanu Reeves was not just a star, he was a standard. Meanwhile, the producer who slapped him could not escape the shadow of his mistake. His empire was gone, his friends vanished. His name became a warning. The more he tried to explain, the more he seemed small, and next to him Keanu seemed larger than life. For Keanu, it was never about winning against another man. It was about winning against anger. He showed the world that true strength is not measured in money, power, or fists. It is measured in the ability to stay calm when the storm is strongest. He showed that dignity shines brighter than arrogance. Fans began to say that Keanu's reaction was not only the reason he was loved in movies, but the reason he was loved in real life. People trusted him. They saw that he was not playing a character when he was kind, he was being himself. And so his philosophy spread. People shared stories about their own lives, how they walked away from fights, how they chose kindness over pride. They said, "If Keanu can do it in front of the whole world, so can we." His calmness created ripples far beyond Hollywood, touching people who would never meet him. The producer had tried to use anger to show power, but Keanu had shown the opposite. True power was in restraint, in silence, in peace. And while the producer became a forgotten man of shame, Keanu became an eternal example, a symbol of what it means to stay human in a world that often forgets. In the end, Keanu's philosophy wasn't about the slap at all. It was about life, about the choices we make every day, about treating people with respect even when they don't deserve it. And that was why people loved him even more. Not for his movies, not for his fame, but for his heart. The fall of the producer was not sudden. Like the slap, it was slow, painful, and humiliating. In the days after the scandal, he still believed he could save himself. He told his assistants, "This will pass. People forget, they always forget." But he was wrong. The world had changed. The cameras had captured his hand striking one of the most loved men in Hollywood, and the world was not ready to forgive. At first, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. He walked into his office, called his lawyers, and spoke to studio heads. He promised that the project would continue, that investors had nothing to fear. But when he looked around the table, he noticed the empty chairs. Men and women who had always rushed to his side did not show up. His closest allies had vanished. They didn't want their names connected to his anymore. Phone calls that once came every hour slowed down. Messages that once filled his inbox disappeared. The silence in his office was deafening. He had always believed people stayed with him because of loyalty. But now he saw the truth. They stayed because of his power. And when that power slipped away, so did they. Investors demanded their money back. The studio officially canceled his $200 million film. Actors broke contracts and left. Lawyers sent letters. The empire he had spent decades building was crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But the financial loss was not the worst part. The worst part was the way people looked at him. Once, he had walked into a room and commanded respect. Now, when he appeared, people turned their faces. Some whispered, some laughed, others walked out. His name was no longer spoken with fear, it was spoken with disgust. Even in public, he could not escape. Strangers shouted insults. Paparazzi followed him. Fans held signs mocking him. Everywhere he went, he was reminded of his downfall. The man who once stood on top of Hollywood was now the most hated figure in the industry. News outlets uncovered old stories. Former assistants told tales of his temper. Crew members revealed how badly he had treated them. Directors admitted they only worked with him because of his money. These stories piled on top of the scandal, proving that the slap was not an accident, but a true picture of who he really was. The public concluded that the mask had finally slipped. As the weeks passed, his isolation grew. He lost friends, he lost allies. He even lost family members who were tired of the shame. His name became a curse in Hollywood. No studio wanted to touch him. No actor wanted to work with him. The man who had once made careers now couldn't even save his own. Meanwhile, name continued to rise. He gave interviews, not about the slap, but about kindness, about peace, about the importance of walking away from anger. His calm words only deepened the wound in the producer's heart, because the world compared them. Side by side, one man was bitter and broken, the other was calm and respected. The producer tried one last attempt to repair his image. He called for a press conference, hoping to apologize in front of the world, hoping to win some sympathy. He walked onto the stage in front of flashing cameras, his face pale, his suit hanging loose from stress. He opened his mouth and said, "I am sorry." But the crowd did not believe him. His words sounded empty, rehearsed, forced. Reporters asked sharp questions. "Why did you do it? Why should people trust you again?" He had no answers. He left the stage in shame, his head down. That was the final nail in the coffin. Studios officially blacklisted him. Investors stopped answering his calls. Even his own office closed its doors. The man who had once dreamed of winning Oscars now became a joke in late-night shows. His face turned into a meme. His name became a warning story. He sat alone in his mansion, staring at his reflection in the glass. Surrounded by luxury but empty inside, money could not buy back respect. Cars, houses, and fame meant nothing when the world despised him. He thought about the night again and again. Replaying the slap in his mind, he wished he could take it back, but it was too late. That single moment had destroyed everything. The empire he had built for decades was gone. His throne had turned to dust, his friends had abandoned him. His name was written in shame. The producer had become the architect of his own downfall. And while he sat in silence, Keanu lived freely, smiling with fans, riding the subway, filming movies, and carrying respect wherever he went. The contrast was cruel, but it was also justice. One man chose pride and violence. The other chose silence and dignity. The world rewarded one and punished the other. In the end, the producer's collapse was more than just a career ending. It was a lesson. It showed how arrogance can destroy a man, how one act of anger can erase a lifetime of work. It proved that in Hollywood, power built on fear cannot last forever. But respect, true respect, can outshine even the brightest lights. And so the man who once thought he was untouchable now lived as a shadow of his former self, haunted by the moment he raised his hand. He struck Keanu, but in truth, he had only struck himself. The story did not end with the slap. It lived on long after the lights of the charity gala faded. People remembered not the sound of the producer's hand, but the silence that followed. The silence of Keanu Reeves walking away, calm and steady. That silence grew louder with time, echoing in homes, offices, and studios across the world. For weeks, newspapers printed the story. For months, people shared the video online. Even years later, when people spoke about Hollywood scandals, this one was always mentioned. But the memory was never about the anger. It was about the dignity of a man who chose peace. Keanu never used the moment to attack the producer. He could have ruined him further with a single interview. He could have turned public anger into personal revenge, but he never did. When asked again and again, he only said, "I hope he finds peace." Simple words, but heavy with meaning. Those words made the world admire him even more. Fans began to see Keanu not just as an actor but as an example of how to live. Parents told their children, "Look at how he handled anger. That's what real strength looks like." Teachers used the story in classrooms. Leaders quoted his response in speeches. It became more than a Hollywood scandal. It became a lesson for everyday life. The producer, meanwhile, faded into the shadows. His name became a warning in the industry. People whispered, "Don't let pride destroy you." It destroyed him. His empire was gone. His friends were gone. All that remained was the memory of his downfall. He had struck another man, but in truth, he had destroyed himself. Keanu, on the other hand, grew brighter. His career reached new heights, not only because of his talent, but because of his humanity. Studios trusted him, directors respected him, and fans loved him more than ever. He showed that kindness was not weakness, and that silence could be the loudest answer. People began to compare the two men. One had everything: money, fame, power, but lost it all in a single moment of anger. The other had nothing to prove, yet gained the love of millions with a single act of restraint. The world saw clearly which path led to destruction and which path led to greatness. In coffee shops, in offices, in families, people repeated the same line: Keanu walked away. Those three words became a symbol. They reminded people that sometimes the strongest action is not to fight, but to refuse to fight. Not to strike back, but to keep your dignity. The story also changed Hollywood itself. Actors and producers who once admired aggression began to rethink. They saw how the public turned against arrogance and rallied around humility. They realized that kindness was not only morally right, but powerful. It built something stronger than fear. It built respect. For Keanu, life continued in a simple way. He rode the subway. He spoke gently to strangers. He gave generously to people in need. He never acted like a man who had won a great battle. He simply lived as he always had. That was the true beauty of it. He did not change because of fame. He stayed the same. And that is why the story lasted, because it was not just about a slap. It was about character. It was about how one man's silence defeated another man's pride. It was about how dignity can outlive anger. In the end, the lesson was clear. Respect matters more than money. Pride destroys faster than any enemy. And true strength is not in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that forgives. The producer lost $200 million, but Keanu gained something priceless: eternal respect. People forgot the exact date of the gala. They forgot the speeches, the music, the food, but they never forgot the moment Keanu stood still, took a breath, and walked away. That image stayed in their minds like a painting, a symbol of grace under fire. Years later, when fans met Keanu, they still brought up the story. They said, "You taught us something that night." And he would only smile, humble as always, never taking credit, but in their hearts, they knew. He had changed the way they saw strength. The producer lived in silence too, but his silence was not respected. It was the silence of shame. Keanu's silence was different. It was powerful. It was remembered. It was celebrated. And so history was written not by the slap, but by what followed. A single second of violence became a lifetime of lessons. The man who lost his temper lost everything. The man who kept his calm gained the world. That is why people still say it. Today, whenever pride and anger rise up, whenever someone feels the need to strike back, they remember the story. They remember the man who proved that silence can speak louder than 1,000 words. They remember Keanu Reeves, the actor who turned humiliation into honor, and taught the world that the costliest strike in Hollywood was never his, it was the other man's.